usual, we're going way beyond your reading. Your reading is just to give you a little background in it. If we can, we'll actually get to some of the reading. I thought it'd be nice just to start off with some basic questions, as we do a lot of times. Do you think mankind and human nature is generally good or bad? And then why? What do you think? Human nature is generally good or bad? Let's just have a vote, see where you guys are at. Who thinks human nature is generally good? Wow. Who thinks it's generally bad? Wow, very positive outlook for most of you. All right, who wants to argue for either side? Human nature, good or bad?
I think it's good, but probably not that hard.
Who wants? Yes.
I feel like people are generally good because if they're learning, they want to learn the right thing to do in their society, so that they're open to doing what they think is right. So they're good.
Okay. Anybody else want to try? Yes.
I say people are naturally good, because I feel like when, a baby is born, or, little kids, they don't see color and racism and things like that doesn't exist to them. They just, having a good time, so, but like, naturally, they're just good.
Well, I understand, but also if you look at kids, they're naturally selfish. You have to really teach them to share. They don't like to share. I mean, my son, today he's actually 4 years old. We had our party yesterday. We had mostly adults. We only had a few kids, but they were like all boys. Oh my God. It was, first of all, so noisy. They're always fighting. There's a lot of crying. They're grabbing things from each other. They're thumping each other. I'm going, holy mackerel. My mom, I have two brothers. My mom used to always complain. I used to thought she was a big complainer. Now I'm thinking, how did she survive? I got one boy, it's rough.
I just think they're competitive nature. That's their competitive side. Look at that.
All right, well, that's a nice way to look at it. Anybody would argue the other side, that our human nature isn't so good? I mean, I wouldn't pick kids as to demonstrate it, although, that was a good example you
I
gave.
just like that specific
Yeah.
reason.
Yeah.
Not the whole.
Yeah, I understand, yeah. Anybody else? You guys don't want to argue? Yes.
I want to argue that we're inherently good, mainly because, human nature, it's mainly, what we want, but, this society has, shown us to, do for others, our human nature is, selfish, but we've, developed this entire world where it's, it's based on you should do good things for other people, so.
They kind of argue both sides. You said generally we're kind of selfish, but society's developed to tell you not to be, right? Yeah, so you kind of argued both sides, but you seems like you're really arguing human nature is not so good, but just to survive we come up with rules. You kind of argue it the other way, I think. Yeah, so, anybody else want to chime in? Well, the reason I raised this is, believe it or not, Confucius had two really big followers, famous followers. One was Mencius and one was Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu spelled Hsun-Tzu. Remember, they all have multiple spellings, but that's one spelling. And Mencius argued that we were generally good, and then he had arguments for why it might only seem we're bad, that circumstances kind of cause us to be bad, but we're generally good. Sun Tzu actually argued the opposite way. He said, look we're naturally selfish, we have to teach a kid to be good, and we're going to talk about Confucian ritual, but he said one of the reasons we need Confucian ritual is to start thinking about other people and beyond ourselves, because we're naturally selfish or bad. I'll tell you what my feeling is. My feeling is, first it's a little bit of an unfair question, are we good or bad? First I'll give you Aristotle. Aristotle believed, remember Aristotle was Plato's student. Aristotle believed we're born either good nor bad, it's all how we're brought up, all our we could call it training, our education. I actually think the answer is not any of the three we just talked about. I think the answer is we're both good and bad. And I just go back to kind of Darwin, what helps us survive. Does being selfish at times help you survive? Absolutely, it does, right? That's why it's not surprising little kids are, you gotta teach them to share, they're thinking about their own survival. Does helping others help you survive? The answer is also yes. When you help others, they're more likely to help you. It's called reciprocity, and we see it not just among human beings in the animal kingdom. In fact, there's been some experts at Ivy League schools that really have set forth, they don't think we would have survived as a race if we didn't have this empathy and sympathy to actually try to help others, which kind of helps the whole group and has helped the species actually survive. So I think we're both good and bad. So it's an interesting debate as you hear, but I'm kind of thinking, well, we're pulling both ways. In fact, one of the reasons I think we need ethics is because we have tendencies both ways, but we kind of have to be reminded sometimes. It's easy to be like a little bit selfish, to remind you we're in a world with others that we should care about. So that's why when I teach ethics, I think, well, we're kind of pulled in different directions, and we have to be reminded. It's not always easy to do, what we call the ethical or right thing toward other people. So we have to be reminded of it. Okay, how about this one? This is a little tricky. What's the most important thing for a society to have? And it's such a big question, you might not know what I'm trying to get at. What's the most important thing for a society to have? Does it have society working well? Does anybody know what I'm asking? You want to try?
I'm thinking order.
Okay, order. Okay, very good. Order and harmony actually would be Confucius's answer, so you did really well. What are some other possibilities? I don't think that would be our answer, by the way, in America. Yes?
An end goal?
What?
An end goal? A goal?
A goal? Okay. I don't know if you need a goal, but all right. Yes?
I feel like
Yeah.
specifically for America's answer would be hierarchy.
Hierarchy. That's maybe a little too general. Yes?
Maybe like rules or laws?
Rules or
I guess that
laws?
plays with order.
Okay. That kind of goes to order, I think. How about, think about what's fundamental to our country. Think about the Constitution. What's fundamental? Freedom and rights. I think we have the Bill of Rights, very fundamental, isn't it? We always think about free speech, the right to freedom of assembly, free press, right? Freedom of religion, debatable, but freedom to own a gun, right? Right? Second Amendment, right? So we think about all these as very fundamental to our society, don't we? We might say our society is built fundamentally on rights and freedom, but Chinese society, do they have as many freedoms as we have? Is their press as free as ours? Is their freedom of speech as free? I don't think so. You can't really talk against the government there like we can. So why? Well, they stress order and harmony. Where does it come from? I think a lot of it from Confucius. Really stress order and harmony. That's kind of the Chinese way of thinking. Okay, let's ask another one. What's the best type of education to have? And so I'm gonna give you two categories. One is a very broad-based education, kind of what we have in America, right? You gotta take a little of this, little of that. Probably a lot of you are in this philosophy class because it feels a little of something, right? It's not that you're a philosophy major. And the other one would be to have a job specific, almost like an apprenticeship, which is kind of the history of the world. To have a type of education where you kind of get trained in one thing and that's what you're gonna do. What do you think's actually better? Which do you guys prefer? Let's just have a vote. Who thinks a broad-based education is really the best thing? Okay, somebody. Who thinks a job-specific education is really the best? Okay, most of you look totally undecided. Or is it too early? You're not sure what? Yeah. What was Confucius's answer? No, very broad-based. And that separated him from everybody really until recent times. People kind of, probably got trained in whatever your father did, right? If you were a son, right? You just did what he did. And so it was always very job specific, but he was really into a very broad-based education, which is interesting. It's kind of like the way college is now, right? Eventually, you'll have to pick a major and you get into specific, but we really start off very broad-based. and expose you to a lot of things. Actually, I think that's kind of what's cool about college, right? You get exposed to a lot of things, say, what do I really like? What's really interests me? Some of you, I'm sure, who knows actually what they want to do in life? Do most of you know or not? Who knows what they want to do? Who's still undecided? Okay, so a lot of you. So I actually think it's fine. Your first 2 years, who's kind of stressed out about being undecided? Okay, a few of you. I mean, I wouldn't be stressed out about it. I think the first 2 years of college, you take a little of everything, see what you love. And the other thing is, I find what you love and major in it. Your major doesn't matter so much. People think, oh, I gotta get the right major. It doesn't matter. You can really major anything and still go to medical school, law school, business school. They take people from all majors. I mean, most people major in a science if they go to medical school because you gotta take a lot of sciences to get into medical school. But you don't actually have to. You can major in philosophy, believe it or not. You can major. So, just find what you like and, take a little of everything and major in it and by the end of 4 years, hopefully you'll know, right? And then you can decide if you need to go to graduate school or whatever. Okay, now this next one's kind of a weird question. What's the best way to get people to do what's right and not do what's wrong? Okay, so I'm gonna write, how do we get people to do what is right? And adding, and not do what's wrong. So I want to give you guys some choices. One is by having a lot of rules and penalties. A second choice will be leaders who lead by setting a good example. A third choice would be general education. A fourth choice would be experimentation on one's own. I don't know, there might be some others. Fifth one, fifth one, let's see what do I have. Oh yeah, fifth one's important. Do what comes naturally. I guess if you think human nature is good, you'd want to pick, maybe you might pick the second one, the fifth one, right? Okay, so what do you guys think? I want to have you all pick one. What's the best way to get people to do what's right and not do what's wrong? Is to have a lot of rules and penalties. Rules and penalties, basically laws, right, that you enforce. Second, leaders who lead by setting a good example. Is that how we get people to do what's right? Just a good general education. Is that how we get people to do what's right? Is it just experimenting on one's own and people kind of figure it out? Or is it, it's not supposed to be a question mark, just do what comes naturally? Okay, so what do you guys, who says that the answer is the first one? Rules and penalties. Who think rules and penalties is the best way to get people to do what's right, not do what's wrong? Okay, raise your hand. 1, 2, wow, only a few of you? 4 of you, 5, I don't know. Alright, you guys keep changing. 6, I don't know, it keeps going up as you think about it more. Who thinks by having leaders who set good examples is the best way to get people to do what's right, not do what's wrong? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I don't know. You guys are, raise your hands high to help me. Alright, third, who thinks by general education, that's the best way? Wow, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, I don't know, 10, at least 10. How many think experimenting on one's own? 1, 2, up on my shoe, okay. And who thinks just doing what comes naturally and people will do what's right? Wow, 1, 2, 3. It's a very interesting class. Again, I might have missed some for all of these, but rules and penalties is how most societies function, isn't it? Have a lot of rules and enforce them, and so we're going to get people to do what's right, not do what's wrong. What did Confucius, he actually probably would go for 2 of these. What are the 2? Yeah, 2 and 3. Leaders who lead by setting a good example is very important to him, and also general education. I think he thinks of, we give people a good education, and he means well-rounded education, and we have leaders who set a good example, people will do what's right and they won't do what's wrong. Experimentation on one's own, believe it or not, that is somebody like Thoreau. You guys heard of Henry David Thoreau, American? I think he was writing pretty much in the early 1800s, probably. Been on Walden's Pond. So on Walden's Pond, who read that book? Any of you guys read that? It's the beginning of the book is fantastic. I think the rest of the book is about pea farming, isn't it? Kind of boring. I mean, I don't know. It's trying to show how you can survive, right? And he just raised one crop, right? And he was very bored, he said, of eating pea soup all the time, because he traded for other stuff.
It's at the beginning of each chapter. He starts off with like the whole idea behind it, and then by the end of it, it's like how to make a cabin or how to water feed correctly.
Yeah, but the very beginning of the book, he actually gives some really good philosophy. I really like it. And he has some very interesting comments. He basically says, you really shouldn't be going for advice and listening to anybody that's older than you. That seems weird, because they have experience, right? Why would he say something like that? I don't think we've talked about this, have we? Why would he say something like that? Yes?
You might be jaded or biased by their experiences.
He may be jaded or biased, okay. All right, good, yes.
Because I think times are changing and, older people, they are stuck in a different time or have different opinions, or like we can see with politics right now, with like the Florida shooting, or how like all the younger generation is like so for gun control and all this, but like the older generation is not. And I think that it will change with the next war.
I think those are two good answers that might be in the back of his mind. But what he actually says is, look at most of the people giving you advice. You wouldn't want their lives. They might be okay for them, but it's not good for you. So why would you listen to their recommendation about your life if you wouldn't want their lives? And so what he expects is really you ought to go and experiment, figure it out on your own. Go live life. Go have experiences yourself and figure out what suits you. It does make some sense, doesn't it? And then the last one, do what comes naturally. That kind of, I think, would be our Taoist answer. Remember we did Taoism last time? Because Taoism, Lao Tzu really assumes, remember, people are naturally good and naturally unselfish. Remember we talked about that? And then he thinks society, when we come together, we end up kind of becoming competitive with each other. I think I gave the example of the American Indian last time, right? And he thought that was more of a natural way to live, where you take care of each other. So that might be, that would be a possible different answer. But I think 2 and 3 is where Confucius is at. So let's start talking about Confucius. So we want to start off again. If you take a philosophy of religion class, you will probably study Confucianism as one of the religions of the world, just like Taoism. And last class, I argued that Taoism probably isn't a religion, because I think you can interpret it that it's not metaphysical at all. Even though it's kind of interesting, it's not, it's mysterious, like, what is the Tao? Well, it lies behind everything we see. I mean, it almost sounds mystical or metaphysical, but it doesn't really have to be interpreted that way. It doesn't clearly say there's anything beyond the physical world, does it? And Confucianism also, I think, is probably not a real religion, because again, what are the two things you need for a religion? You need an ethics and a metaphysics. Clearly has a very strong ethics. That's what Confucianism is all about. He's giving advice on how to live your life. That's an ethics. But is there metaphysics? The only thing in the way of metaphysics is he does talk about one of the rituals that's very important is ancestor worship. You should, kind of do prayers and maybe a lot of them have a little shrine in their house to their ancestors. But does that mean he actually even believed the ancestors had a spirit that could hear you worshiping or knew it? It doesn't necessarily mean that. Because I think for Confucius, the ritual itself is what's valued. You're learning to pay respects to what came before you, and in a sense, it gets you out of your own selfish thinking to be appreciative, right, of what other people have given you and other people in the world. So it doesn't even necessarily mean that he believed there were these spirits other than what we know about. It's very questionable whether it should be labeled as a religion. It seems more like a philosophy. And frankly, if you were even to go to China and you'd say, do you have a religion? A lot of people would say yes, but almost none of them would actually say Confucianism. There would probably be a few million that would say that, according to studies, but that's not too many. But we also should always remember that people kind of start adding things to the philosophy, so then it starts to kind of look a little more like religion, right? But it's not really in his philosophy. He doesn't talk about God or gods or anything like that. It's just not there in his philosophy. Now, we talked about Lao Tzu, the founder of Taoism, that we really don't know who the person was. We're not even sure when he lived. We don't even know for sure it's only one person who wrote the Tao Te Ching, although it's pretty short, so it's believable it could be mostly one person. But they actually think, I don't think I told you, for the Tao Te Ching, they actually think there was one person that wrote it, but then some passages were added later, specifically the ones that take a shot at Confucianism, because Confucius, they think, came a little bit after Lao Tzu. So that's what they think. Well, Confucius himself supposedly didn't write anything down, but his students did. And so the main book that's attributed to Confucius is called the Analects. So I wrote it down, the Analects. And the Analects are just a compilation of his teachings, but his teachings are mostly kind of little sayings or little stories. They're pretty short. Some of them are a little longer than when we saw passages from the Tao Te Ching for Taoism, but most of them are pretty short, and some of them are just wise sayings. And we'll talk a little bit about that. In fact, remind me, I want to tell you about my exposure as a kid a little bit to Confucianism. But Confucius had a very large impact on the educational system of China and on the government, because the officials and rulers all had to study Confucius's teachings and took exams based on his teachings. Now, this didn't happen right after he died. It took a while, but I think it started a little bit before the time of Christ, or right around there, and it went until about the last century. Then it stopped. The communists, didn't do that, obviously. They came in 1949, right? But he really had an enormous and influential impact. Confucius is described as a wise, clever, and incorruptible man, a model gentleman, and a human-hearted man. So let's make sure, wise, clever. What does incorruptible mean? What does that word mean? Yes?
You don't let things sway you?
You don't let things sway you. Yeah, that's a way to put it. You certainly don't let... I think what we want to say is, you don't let your selfish interests get in the way of doing what's right. Maybe it'd be a better way to do it, right? So, like, corruptible people, for example, can be bribed, right? Somehow, either with money or favors or something. But they would say that he was very incorruptible. The story of his life is he went around China, talking, and he had a following. People would follow him from town to town. But he went from town to town, and he wasn't always welcome. In fact, they say that some of his followers got beat up and things like that. And he always, the story is that he always wanted to get a permanent job advising one of the local rulers. Again, China wasn't united yet at this time. And that they think that maybe at the end of his life, not the very end, but as he got somewhat older, he finally got one of those gigs. He got a job where he was advising a ruler. And it only lasted a few years, and then he got kicked out. Why? Well, they say because he was incorruptible. Very good music. All right, they thought of from an imperial palace. Very nice, very regal. Okay, that's okay. So they said that he would tell the truth to the person he was advising, and the person doesn't always want to know the truth. You can't handle the truth. That's from a movie, but anyway. But it's from Network. You guys ever see the movie? Very good movie. You can't. What's that? No, that was from an officer and a gentleman. What was it? A Few Good Men. That's what it was from. You can't handle the truth. Yeah, Network was. I'm not going to take it anymore. Wasn't it like that? Anyway, all right. Get all my movies mixed up. Okay. Anyway, but he supposedly gave advice the ruler wasn't thrilled about hearing it. We're gonna hear what some of that advice may have been, by the way, in a few minutes. And so again, he got kind of kicked out, and then he was, he went about his business. Taoism really looks at nature, and it talks about human beings harmonizing with nature and everything, harmonizing with each other. Confucius's emphasis wasn't as much on nature, it was more on people and society. How can we have people and society work well together? So let's talk a little bit more about Confucius. His Chinese name is actually Kong Zi, and he was known as Kong Fu Zi. And Kong Fu Zi actually means teacher Kong. And the reason I think it's important to say it is, he was very clear he was a teacher, but not surprisingly, after he died, people tried to make it into a god. People were superstitious, and we're going to see later in the course, the Hindus actually made Buddha into one of their gods. So this is actually very, very common. But he himself was very clear he was a person, he wasn't a god, and he was a teacher. There's a story about his life. Now, we don't really know about his life because the first biographer we know about lived in 80 BC. Well, he was dead for hundreds of years already. I mean, can you imagine if we were doing a biography about somebody that lived in the 15 or 1600s and this is the first biography done, would you feel like it was very reliable? I don't think so. If this is the first one, you go, well, no one else wrote anything, why should we believe you? When you write something hundreds of years later, it's actually right. So we really don't know, but this is the story, and I think it could be true. The story is he was born into a poor but respected family who may have actually been aristocratic refugees who fled when a war broke out. So the story is he actually grew up kind of, he was born into a family that was rich and educated, but they had to flee when he was a little boy, and so he actually grew up poor. His father supposedly died soon after his birth, and he had to do hard work, what they call menial labor. Now, why do I think that story might actually be true? Well, to me, it really makes sense. First of all, supposedly he wasn't not from a rich and wealthy family. He didn't have riches, but he was educated. Clearly was educated. He went around teaching. Well, in those days, the only people that were educated were rich and powerful, right? They could afford private tutors. So you'd say, well, if you were born into a rich and powerful family and your mother could teach you, right, these things because she knew it, it makes sense. The other thing is he seemed to really care about the poor, which makes sense that he was poor. Because unlike other teachers, he accepted both rich and poor. A lot of his students, by the way, were from wealthy families and actually went on then to become the, leaders of their area. Again, China's not unified, but they had little kingdoms, right? And they became leaders. So one of the reasons I think we're studying Confucius today is because his students became famous and wrote down his teachings and learned his teachings. And so he didn't just kind of die with the history books. We actually are studying about him. So I think this actually, the story makes a lot of sense. There's an old story too, is he said, okay, now, if you were poor and you came to him, did you have to pay? The answer was yes, in a way. Because it's right in the Analects. He says, well, even a poor person can go catch a fish and give it to me for my dinner. So what's his point? Well, he's extending his time, right? He doesn't have time to go fishing because he's teaching, so you have to show that this is really important to you, that his time is important. So it wasn't that he was doing it for free, right? He did expect people, and even a poor person could make efforts. He maybe couldn't give him money, but he could give him something. All right, let's get to his teachings. Houston Smith wrote the book that for many, many years was the most, was really the book that was used, I think, at most universities to teach comparative religion. Did I mention him last time? Maybe I did. Houston Smith. By the way, I think he's still alive. He's got to be about 200 years old, but because he wrote this book, the first version, a really long time ago. And I still use it when I teach my philosophy of religion class. I actually do some comparative religion, and I actually use his book too. And what Houston Smith did is he went to these other countries and tried to literally live the religion for a little while. So he really gives you a flavor for the religion. And he breaks down Confucius's teachings into 5 main areas. So I put it over here. So these are the 5 areas. Let's just put 5 areas of Confucius's teaching. Okay, so what are the areas? Well, remember I told you there's more than one spelling for most, or for many Chinese words because the English translators heard the words differently. So the first one is Jen or Ren, and that's, we normally translate benevolence, sometimes that's translated as human-heartedness, which just means kind of having a good human heart. And so benevolence, my understanding is that Chinese character looks like two people kind of holding hands, like, you're helping each other. So Jen Ren is benevolence, helping other people. A second big area of his philosophy is the Chun Tzu, and that's just one of his names for the superior person, the person we should strive to be. So Chun Tzu, and he talks about what are the attributes of the Chun Tzu. A third big area of his philosophy is Li. Now Li consists of more than one thing. It's sometimes translated as propriety and ritual. So propriety is like having good manners, acting, appropriately toward people. And rituals, you guys kind of know, there's different kinds of rituals. One would be a ritual, right, to your ancestors to show them respect, but there's all different kinds of rituals. In fact, and these kind of get combined into one. So for example, if you read the Analects, he does talk about some of these kinds of rituals or manners. So let's give an example. If you saw me outside of class, for example, let's say you were out shopping at the mall and I was there, what Confucius would say, since I'm your teacher, there's certain ways you approach me. There's certain ways you look at me. You may, I don't know what they are. It's like maybe you don't look me directly in the eyes and you're kind of more humble about it. And it's just the way you do it, it really is set forth. One of the rituals he talks about that's very, very important is he talks about the ritual when a parent dies, that the way you should behave. And it really, I always forget if it's 2 or 3 years, it might have been in your reading, how long that basically you're not really supposed to go out partying for a few years, out of respect for your parent. And in a sense to express how important they were to your life, and to be very solemn about it. And so there's certain ideas of how you should behave. You can go to work, but you come home and kind of stay at your house. You're not out socializing. So some of these things to us look really, it doesn't make sense to us in modern day America. But Confucius thought rituals were vital. And I think it was in your reading, didn't he talk about this in your reading? About how important it was? Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more. But so sometimes people make a joke that these are the two rights. Propriety is acting the right way. Rituals are sometimes called rights. You see how these are spelled differently? It's a little bit of a joke, but the two rights. So Li, propriety and ritual. The next one is Da. Remember, we saw this with the Tao Te Ching, you guys remember? And we talked about power, but I said it sometimes translates virtue or power. What was the translation I like better? Excellence, you guys remember? So remember the Tao Te Ching is the book of the way, and it's excellence, was I thought the way to do it. Well, this is a very specific idea. It's the power of setting a good example. Another way to put that would be the excellence of setting a good example. This is very important. For Confucius, he thought everybody has a duty to set a good example. Leaders do, parents do, everybody does, to set a good example for other people. And the last big area is when we can just say the arts, music, art, painting, poetry, things like that, that Confucius thought was very, very important. Now, having said this is the 5 big areas, many experts have said 2 of these areas, we can actually boil it down to 2 areas primarily, not just 5. What do you think the 2 areas would be? Who wants to guess which 2 of the 5 are the most important probably?
1 and 4.
1 and 4, so that's benevolence and the power of setting a good example. Okay. Who else? Who else wants to give it a shot? Yes.
3 and 4.
3 and 4, propriety, ritual, and power of setting a good example. Okay. 1 and 3, benevolence and propriety. Somebody guess? 4 and 5? Okay, 4 and 5, power is a good example in the arts. Okay, you actually got it right. 1 and 3. So let's just see why that would be. So we have benevolence and propriety and ritual. So let's just think about the arts. Why did Confucius think that the arts were important? The answer, I think, is because he thought when we do the arts, we're not thinking about ourselves and our own selfish ways. We're kind of thinking of a bigger picture. It's almost like we want to give, express our creativity and give a gift to the world. And he thought the arts helped us actually become more benevolent, to have the focus off of ourselves and learn how to become more benevolent. I mean, if we kind of think about that, it does seem that artists tend to be more liberal about helping others. Doesn't it kind of seem like that in general? They're more like that. So we can kind of see maybe that makes sense. The power of setting a good example, we might say, well, what is the good example you're supposed to set? And the answer is you should be benevolent, and you should follow the right propriety and follow the ritual. So that's the right one. The Chun Tzu, the superior person, what are the attributes that he should have? Well, the biggest ones are benevolence and lead, propriety, and ritual. So we can see these other three kind of oils still kind of go back to 1 and 2. Well, what if between propriety and ritual and benevolence, if we had to choose one of those, this is my thinking on this, which one do you think is the most important? It's got a 50-50 chance on this one. 1 or 3, what do you think? Let's have a vote. Who thinks this is the most important? Benevolence. Who thinks Lee is the most important? Okay. Who's not voting? Why do you want voting? Too many non-voting members of this Congress here. All right, anyway. I think it's number 1. And the reason being, if we think about it, why does Confucius want us to engage in propriety and ritual? I think because he thinks it helps us be benevolent. Because when you're having to focus on doing the right things for your ancestors or for others, to showing the proper respect and having good manners toward others, this is in servance of benevolence, helping others. So the propriety and ritual is trying to get you out of your kind of selfish head and be thinking about other people. So I still think benevolence is driving it. But then we can go back, why does he care so much about benevolence? And I think the answer is what's driving all of his philosophy is order and harmony. Because when you are helping people, if we have societies where our focus is to help others, and of course to have good manners while we're doing it, I think he thinks it fosters order and harmony. But then we might say, why was order and harmony so important? Remember we talked today about how we stress rights in America, but they stress order and harmony. And I think the answer is because Confucius knew he came from a family that fled for their lives after a war broke out, and his family kind of lost their status because of war. And so his feeling was order and harmony is something that's really important in society, and we shouldn't be so contentious. In fact, if we kind of analyze it, what would Confucius think about modern day America right now? Well, let's be more specific. Wrong. I mean, so divisive, isn't it? Not order and harmony. Every day he's just insulting people. Now he's taking he took a shot, I just read in the paper this morning, I read on the internet, at Oprah Winfrey. She's so nice, isn't she? I don't know. What would you say about Oprah? He goes, I hope she runs against me. I know how to get her. Oh my God. Is that what politics should be, about getting people? Shouldn't it be about caring about us and America and having a nice country? I'm gonna get it. It's a competition. But you guys kind of see, this is the opposite. Confucius, I think, would be horrified. And I am too. All right, anyway. That Trumpster. Okay, anyway. Any questions from what we just did? So, all right. So we're going to talk about in a second the 5 great relationships. But one of the ways that this Li, or propriety and acting, is expressed itself is in the 5 great relationships. Now, I want to say something else. This is important, and Confucius is very clear about this. These rituals and the good manners you go for, you have to really get it. You can't just go through the motions and do it, or he actually says it's useless. You have to understand why you're doing it and why it's important, so you do it with feeling and you like doing it. It's kind of like becomes a part of you. To just go through the motions doesn't really do anything, okay? In fact, maybe you're going to be resentful, right, that you have to go through the motions. He wants us to really feel while you're doing them. Now, something else about his teachings. Confucius claims that he's not original. What he actually did is he studied China from about 400 to 500 years before he lived. And what his feeling was that China was in a very peaceful period then. A lot of order and harmony, and people really treated each other well. They had good manners, good propriety. They observed the rituals. Now maybe he had a misreading of history, but that was his reading of it. At least that was in the books he studied. It seemed like things went much better. And so he felt he wasn't being original, he was just bringing back the way things had always been, or at least they had been in the past when China was governed well, and there weren't so many wars, and there really was order and harmony in China. Okay. Now, we're always dealing with translations, so I put on the board one translation. What you do not want done to you, do not do to others. So that's a translation of something Confucius said. Does that sound like anything you've ever heard? It's a golden rule of Christianity, isn't it? All right, well, let's see. It's a golden rule that Jesus made it a centerpiece of his philosophy, right? Who lived first, Confucius or Jesus? Confucius, right? About 500 BC, about 500 years earlier. But we do want to say, where did Jesus pick it up from? Anybody know? The golden rule is actually in Leviticus, I think. So it was already in the Bible that Jesus studied. Jesus just made it a centerpiece of his philosophy, but it was already there. So I just think it's kind of basic wisdom, right, that any society would probably go to. So he did say something known as the golden rule, okay? Now he said something else, and again, we're going to go with some of the translations. Not all the translations are clear, it says this. I read a bunch of them, but at least some of the translations go like this. We'll try to fill this in. Repay kindness with, this is from Confucius, what would we put? With kindness, okay, makes sense. Repay kindness with kindness. Okay, let's look at the next part. Repay evil with, what do you think we put here? Who says kindness? Okay, what did I used to do for a living? Can you trust lawyers? No, now always keep that in mind, I led you that way. Okay, it's repay evil with justice. Now, I of course led you that, because I want us to distinguish it from Jesus. Jesus would say, I think, repay kindness with kindness, repay evil with kindness, right? But we're not studying Jesus, we're studying Confucius. Now this is the irony. If we look how Christianity is usually practiced, is it practiced based on what Jesus said, or what Confucius said? It seems like Confucius, right? Listen to us, repay evil with justice, not with kindness, right? So that's the irony. It seems to be more with what Confucius said. Repay evil with justice. Okay, I'm not writing it down because I have a class after you, so I want to not give them the answer when they want it. All right. Okay. Any questions on anything so far? All right, let's go over the 5 great relationships. So the 5 great relationships, we can actually call this the centerpiece of his philosophy. And they're very, very important. So, believe it or not, there is some disagreement on what the 5 great relationships are, but we'll go through it. 4 of them, I think, are uncontroversial. The first one, ruler and subject. Second, these are in no particular order. Father and son. Husband and wife. These three are totally uncontroversial. They're on every list. But he does talk on different, he has a lot of philosophy. They don't always come out exactly the same. Usually they talk about eldest son, or younger sons, and elders, juniors. But some of them substitute, especially, it can be substituted either for 4 or 5, and usually for 5 instead of elders, juniors. Sometimes they say it's actually friend to friend, believe it or not. It's friends. So let's ignore the friends one for now. Let's go with these 5. I think these are still the more standard ones with the interpretations of the 5 great relationships. Now, we can kind of see there's kind of, if we want to put it this way, there's kind of a higher and a lower. You kind of see that? The ruler and the subject, the father and the son. You guys see that? Now, do the people in the second, we call it the second column, the lower, right? Do they owe duties to the people in the first column? Okay, that one I think is easy, right? They do, right? The son owes his father duties, the subject owes the ruler. We're going to talk about the duties are in a second. But this is the next question is, but what about the people in this first column that we can say seem to be in a higher position? Do they also owe duties to the people in the lower position, or do they not? What do you guys think? They do. So there are duties owed going both directions. So that's right, duties in both directions. And they're kind of interesting to look at the duties. So let's just start off. So they say that the son or the child owes the duty of, let's put this one, so let's do this one first. Filial piety. Well, what is filial piety? Technically filial means brother or sister, but that's not what they mean. Piety means reverence, right? So it's reverence for your parent, reverence for your father. That's what they're talking about. See, the son owes filial piety. What does that mean? Listen to your father. Make his life easier for him, right? He's he's providing for you. What does the father owe? He owes his son to be loving and kind. So he does have duties. The younger brothers owe humility and respect. The eldest brother, they say, owes gentility. Elders and juniors owe deference to elders. Elders have to be humane and considerate. Again, I'm not going to test you on exactly these because they're all kind of similar, but just to get a feel for this. Subjects owe loyalty to the ruler. Rulers owe benevolence to the people, according to Confucius. We'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so husband and wife. This one's kind of funny today. So the claim is that wives owe 2 big duties to husbands. Now, one of them's maybe to have kids, but let's forget that one, okay? What are the 2 big duties you think? Now remember, we're going back 2,500 years ago. What does a wife owe her husband? Usually claim is obedience. The other one you would never get, to be a good listener. Now this is very funny. I'm convinced in modern day America, this is totally reversed. What do I owe as a husband to my wife? Obedience, and I must be a good listener. I don't know what happened to modern day America. We reviewed some Confucius, I'm making a joke obviously, but all right. It's a little humor. Okay, so they claim it's obedience of being a good listener. Although I don't know that that's clearly in the Analects, but that's what they claim nowadays. The husband does owe righteous behavior, however. He has to treat his wife fairly and justly. Let's talk about the subject and the rulers. So the subject owes loyalty, but the rulers owe benevolence to the people. What does that mean? You have to care about the people. You have to treat them well. You have to try to help them. Benevolence is helping others. Do you think most rulers wanted to hear that at his time? No. How did you become a ruler in those days? Yeah, basically you were a conqueror, or you were the son or grandson of a conqueror, right? And so they pretty much felt they made the rules, right? You didn't want to hear that you owed any duties to the people. And so that was one of the reasons that I think Confucius may have had trouble getting hired full-time by one of these people because he wasn't corrupt. He would actually tell them, you have an obligation to do what you can for the people. Most rulers don't want to hear about any obligation. If they do what they figure they're doing the people a favor, not because it's their duty. So that was one of the reasons he might have gotten in a little trouble. Now we want to notice some things. The first thing is that the self, who a person is largely defined by these relationships. And this is, I think this was in your reading too. And so the self, or who a person is largely relational for a Chinese person. It's our relationships. This is very different than modern day America, where we are much more individualistic, aren't we? Well, let's just think about it. So if you guys go on a date, what do you usually talk about? You talk about your interests, right? What you talk about? That's what, you try to make yourself cool, right? I do this cool thing. Really? How many times you've done it? Well, I dreamed about it once, but you sound cool, right? Because you almost did it one time, right? And you try to make yourself sound really cool with all your cool interests. But that's not the kind of conversation, at least historically, a Chinese person would have. They actually talk about their family. They talk about where they were in the family. You might mention it on the first date. They might not know if your brother is a sister until you had many dates, right? But in that first time you were together was in China, that would be really important, that I'm the second son. What your position is in the family would be really, and tell a lot about you. If you're the first son, you probably have more obligations to your father, right? You have to be the most attentive. But then if you're the second son, you owe obligations not only to your father, but also to your older brother, right? So it tells you a lot. The relationship is much, much more important. And I just read an article, and it actually shows up in business, I think, even today. Because their business is based in China on, do they have a relationship with you? So I think in America, we kind of trust people until they give us a reason not to. Even in business, we think, well, if you can make me money, I can make you money. It's cool. I'm going to trust you until you show me I shouldn't. In China, it's not really like that. They don't trust you at all. You have to, because you're not in any relationship with them. It isn't until you built a relationship that trust is going to be there. And they may not feel they have any duty to treat you well until you have that relationship. It's a very different way of being. That's according to this article. And yesterday at my son's birthday party, I had somebody who was a American businessman that does business in China, and has actually lived in China for years at a time. And he told me the same thing. So it's interesting. I got confirmation of the article I just read. So it's interesting how these things still kind of show up, right? So things are very, very relational. I'm going to give you a personal story. So when I grew up, I used to see these movies called Charlie Chan movies. So you guys ever heard of Sherlock Holmes? Okay, so Sherlock Holmes is this, fictional, not real, was a detective, basically, right? The greatest detective to ever live. All right, well, they had one called, this was a bunch of movies they made with Charlie Chan. So he was a Chinese detective, but he was like, I think he was American, but he was like, came to America and he was this detective. So Charlie Chan, and he would solve all the crimes, and it was really cool. He'd get everybody in the room, all the suspects, and then he kind of had this discussion and figure it out, and of course he'd always get the right one. So it's a great detective. Well, on a lot of the episodes, his son, not in real life, but in his supposed, he had somebody play his son, right, that would help him. His son was his assistant. What was his son's name? Have you ever seen a Charlie Chan movie? No, wait, okay. Some of my classes, some people have actually seen them. They're really old, but they're actually really good. Well, the answer is, I think they never told us. Because they always referred to him as number one son. Think about this, number one, why? Because that's what was important to them. His position. His position in the family was more important than his name. I don't think we ever got to know his name. Here, so he introduced another. Here's number one son. It's his oldest son, right? So it is kind of funny. It tells you how. I think that the people who made the movie got it right. This is how important your relationship was. Okay. Next thing, we should notice something. If we look at these 5 things, we're gonna see 2 things are stressed a lot. 2 things are stressed. In other words, 3 of the 5 deal with one thing, and another 3 of the 5 deal with another. What are the 2 things? We can see what the Chinese value. What's stressed in the 5 great relationships?
Family and age.
Family, very good. Family and respect for elders. If you think about family, all right, here's family. Father, son, husband, wife, eldest son, younger sons, right? That's all family relationships. So 3 of the 5 deal with family. And then the other one, when we have age, we have father, son, eldest son, younger son, and elders, juniors. So we see this great respect for age. Now, in our country, we all want to look what? We want to look younger, right? We got the Botox, we got the plastic surgery. Most of them I find to be very scary. Oh my goodness, have you seen some of these plastic surgeries? I guess they're getting better at it. My mom smoked a lot, so you get more wrinkles. She had plastic surgery, and it was really terrible in those days. You know, for 2 weeks she couldn't come home, and she comes home, and finally it heals, and she says, "Oh, I think it looks great, Randy. What do you think?" And I'm like horrified. First of all, I don't recognize her, and second of all, I don't think it looks too good. She doesn't look human anymore. And of course, I said, "Mom, you're looking great." Well, what are you gonna do? All right, anyway. But believe it or not, in China, you probably want to look older. It's okay to have the wrinkles. Now, that may be changing. We're exporting our poor values around the world. But in the past, you wanted to look older. Why is there so much respect for elders? Why do you think? Yes?
Because they're wise and they have more life experience.
I think that's the answer. If you think about it, going back 2,500 years, first of all, not only did we not have the internet, I know it's hard to imagine, right? Not only did we not have an internet, most people couldn't read or write. We didn't have the Encyclopedia Britannica or World Book. These are the encyclopedias I grew up with before the internet, right? But we didn't really have anything. So let's just think. Let's think that you are experiencing an earthquake. You don't even probably know what it is. You've never heard of an earthquake. You didn't study about earthquakes. So who would you go to find out what happened? The earth was shaking. Well, maybe the elder had actually lived through one. They've lived longer than anybody else. They may have the experience to help you know about that. Or let's say, you're worried about being attacked from another country or another area. Well, the elder's maybe been through a few wars. He can tell you a little bit what to expect, or is it likely or unlikely. So people that were older were really the repositories of knowledge. They really knew a lot more just because they'd been around a lot longer, and most people couldn't read, and there weren't many books anyway. There was no place to really consult anything. So it's just hard for us to believe in our world, the information age, but there wasn't a lot of information. So elders were really valued for their experience and their wisdom, and they really were helpful to their society. Of course, also they helped take care of the grandkids and all the other stuff, which we do a little bit in our society, but not as much. All right, a couple other things that they that said about the Confucian 5 great relationships. People notice, we've already said this, they're asymmetrical. What does that mean? Although there are duties going both directions, the subject owes loyalty. The ruler doesn't owe loyalty, owes benevolence. They're just different duties on each side. Asymmetrical means they're not exactly equal, right, on each side. The next thing we want to notice, and this is very important. Most people can interpret Confucius as saying that if you do not do your duty, then you relieve the other side of the relationship from having to do their duty. Let's make sure we really get this, because this is where, again, you can see why some rulers won't like them. If the ruler is not benevolent to the people according to this, then the people don't owe the ruler loyalty. Do you see how that would work? That would be pretty radical if that's what he really said. That would be pretty radical for the time. Which kind of brings us to the next point I want to make, because it's related to that. So I want to put on the board, there's something known as rectification of names. Now, he didn't use this term, I don't think, like that, but it's something that's attributed to Confucius. What is the word rectification? What does it mean to rectify?
Correct.
To correct or make right. So what this idea is that language is really powerful. We need to use the right terms. We need to make sure that we are not mischaracterizing things. So, because it'll get us in trouble. So let me give you a couple of examples of rectification of names so you can actually understand it. So let's just think of a couple of examples. Let's do this one. How about no child left behind? Anybody ever hear of that? So that's the law now, right? Now, what's that law about? Anybody know?
Children will not be left behind in class in like previous grades, something like that. They'll be forced forward and a socially progressive education system.
Well, all right, let's just say the theory is, without getting too exact, I think it's legislation regarding education, make sure everybody gets a good education. Right. Now, in reality, are children left behind with this legislation?
Yes.
I've told a lot of children. So it's a violation of rectification of names, right? This is what legislators love to do. They name their legislation such a nice name. Who would be against, right? Good education for children, right? You don't want to vote against that, except for that's not really what it does. You make it sound like it's a nice thing, but you're really misleading, so you're violating rectification of names. Let me give you another example that in my day, everybody would have known, but you guys, most of you probably don't know it. Who's ever heard of the PLO? Okay, no, it does it. All right, it stands for the Palestine Liberation Organization. Have you guys heard of that? So the PLO, I mean, they still exist. They exist. If you go to Israel, right, and where it's the part that is run by the, by the Arabs, basically, right? So now they used to be. Okay, first of all, liberation. What does that mean? It's freedom, right? It sounds like a real nice thing. They used to be characterized as a terrorist organization. Okay. So if you think they're a terrorist organization, then calling yourself a liberation organization would be a violation of rectification of names. You make it sound like you're a nice group when you go around, killing people and suicide bombers and all that. Now they've changed. They have changed. At least I think they're not nearly as radical because they're kind of administering the West Bank. But they used to be known as a terrorist organization. They were at least on the Americans' list. All right. So you can see, you're right, this rectification names are right. Well, how is this important to Confucius? Well, again, if you mistreated your son, then you are not worthy of being called the name father, and so your son does not owe you filial piety, technically. Because you're not acting as a father acts, so you don't deserve to be called a father. That would be a violation of rectification of names, because if you're a father, there are certain obligations and duties that come with it, like treating your kids nicely, fairly, encouraging them to develop, right? Things like that. So you do have these kinds of obligations. And similarly, what we just said, the ruler is no longer to be called a ruler if he doesn't care about the benevolence of the people, because that's a violation of rectification of names, because a ruler to Confucius is someone that cares about the people and tries to help them. Does that make sense to you guys? So this is, I think, an important concept for Confucius. They say, when we talk about the Chun Tzu, the superior person, they say the superior person has certain qualities. He has self-respect. He has magnanimity, which means he's free from pettiness. He's generous in forgiving insults. He also has sincerity. He has serious intention or earnestness. He is benevolent. He never is insincerely polite. He is genuinely polite. We talked about that. Supposedly Confucius did not like people that were, glib talkers or just goody goods, he wanted people to really care about what they were doing. He thought the superior person to act with proper propriety or lee was natural. He didn't really look at it as a duty. Okay, any questions on what we've done so far? You guys getting a feel for Confucius a little bit? Okay. Let's talk about why do we study Confucius? I mean, I did say that his students wrote down his teachings and he became famous in his own lifetime and famous after his lifetime. So it's part of the reason 2,500 years ago we're studying him. And he claimed, as I said, he was not an innovator. He says, look, I'm just teaching what the old masters taught hundreds of years before I was alive. But I think he sells himself short. I think the reason we're studying him is he was a traditionalist in some ways, right? Traditional regarding the rituals and propriety. But he also was an innovator. So in what ways was he an innovator? Well, we talked about some of these already. The first one I said he's egalitarian. He's taught students of all social backgrounds. We mentioned, even if you were poor, you could fish and, that would provide kind of your payment for the lesson. But he would teach anybody that made an effort and really wanted to learn, he would teach them. During his time, it was pretty unheard of. It was really only rich people that could afford to have teachers. And so that was, I think, very innovative. Second, the way we kind of teach college is really, I think, comes from Confucius, to have a broad-based liberal education. So he taught a lot of different subjects. He supposedly taught language and literature and history and ethics and music and athletics and aesthetics. What does the word aesthetics mean? Beauty. Probably was talking about the beauty of nature, right? Just to appreciate nature and the beauty of nature. And so he taught that. We could call that, I wrote it here, a broad-based and unspecialized education. He thought that was important. Why? To make you well-rounded. He thought was really what was important. Which one of the subjects I just said do you think is the most important? Language, literature, history, ethics, music, athletics, aesthetics. Which one do you think? I think it's the ethics. Which kind of leads us to the third way. He stressed developing good character over just knowledge of facts. Now, there's nothing wrong with knowing a lot of facts. That's a good thing. You can use them right in your life. But for him, it just seemed what all his philosophy is about is developing good character. By the way, have you guys have you ever heard any Confucius' sayings? He's got all these famous sayings. They're pretty cool stuff. I should have brought some. But anyway. Fourth, Confucius stressed focus on this life and not on any possible future lives or on God. So we could say he really de-emphasized religion and metaphysics. Okay, focus on this life, not on any possible future lives. He was actually asked questions about that. He was asked questions about what happens when you die, and he says, look, I'm having enough trouble, I'm paraphrasing, he basically says, I have enough trouble figuring out what to do in this life, let alone worrying about what happens after I die. What's he telling you? Focus on this life. We know we have this, we're not sure what happens afterwards. Focus on this life. This life is of paramount importance. And I think this really distinguishes him. Because in those days, people were very superstitious. They believed in many gods. They believed in their spirits of the forest. And whenever he was asked questions like that, as far as we know, he would duck the questions. He'd say, look, don't worry about all these things we don't really know about. Focus on building your good character. That's enough in this lifetime. To get that straight, that's a big enough challenge. So he de-emphasizes metaphysics and he de-emphasizes spirits and the kinds of things people talked about, and I think that makes him a groundbreaker. Did he believe in God? Well, we have no idea. He just doesn't talk about stuff like that. Which kind of flows into the next point. He taught an ethics, ethics in this case would just mean a way of life, without a religious or metaphysical base. Taught an ethics without a religious or metaphysical base. And it really gets reflected in a very famous saying from him. You should pursue morality for its own sake. Pursue morality I wrote for its own sake. Another way you could say is pursue morality for morality's sake. Well, that's basically saying what? You should do what's right, why? Because it's right, for no other reason. Well, who does that sound like? Who? Kant. That was Kant's moral worth. What's moral worth? When you do what's right because it's right. What does he say? You should do what's right, why? Because it's right. Isn't it interesting? Of course, Kant lived in the 1700s. It's more than 2,000 years after Confucius. We got to give Confucius a little more credit here, right? Not that we want to take it away from Kant, but we have to give Confucius. Pursue morality for its own sake. Well, what's the point of that? You shouldn't pursue morality so you'll be rewarded by the gods or for the results. He just said you should do what's right because it's right. There's nothing more to really say. That's just the way it is. If you do what's right because it's right, then you're fulfilling your duty. The last thing we want to say is he really does, and I think again he's groundbreaking, he really does outline a life of self-cultivation. It's a life that you always strive to be better and better. Again, I wish I brought in some more of the quotes. I should have maybe done that. But he has this great quote. He says, at 30, I learned this. At 40, I learned this. At 50, I learned this. At 60, and I think he goes all the way up to 70. I'm not sure. And he says, at 70, I finally now am, doing pretty well. I'm usually, usually acting morally of good character. He never claimed he was perfect, He, in fact, has a very famous saying. He says, I've never met a person who has been virtuous for an entire day. I have never met someone that's been benevolent for an entire day. You go, why not? Well, I think his point is because we tend to think about, we get hungry, we think about food, that's a selfish desire. It's hard to go a whole day without thinking of yourself. So he's not saying that's a horrible thing, but he's pointing out it is so natural to think about yourself. And so that's why do we need these teachings? We need teachings about benevolence so we get off the focus on the self. But again, who did we also talk about in this class that stressed a life of self-cultivation? Socrates. We started the class with Socrates, remember? So this is what Socrates was all about. A life of continually trying to improve. He says, I want to improve. I ask all these questions to improve myself and you. It's a paraphrase, right? He actually says that, Socrates. So I think they're both outlining a very similar life. And remember, they lived about at the same time, didn't they? They lived at about the same time. Confucius was a little bit older, but they were very close in time. So I think their lives overlap, by the way. But I don't think they ever heard of each other. One was in China, one was in Greece. There was no internet, no newspapers, no jet planes or cars to get around. Doubtful they ever heard of each other. But it is interesting. They both are outlining a life where you continually try to improve. What was the saying we heard from, the famous saying from Socrates? The unexamined life is not worth living. Well, he said similar things, right? Try to keep getting better. Try to keep improving your character. It's a challenge for all of us in this life. Even he has to keep working at it. So I think he is outlining a similar type of life. Okay, any questions on Confucius? Maybe we'll read a little bit, but I want to have time to actually tell you a little bit about the test too, because that's on Wednesday. Let's go real quickly to page 306, and we just look a little bit. Page 306, he says, second column, almost halfway down, we got these three dots. He says, we must appreciate that for Confucius we are fundamentally relational, not individual selves. We talked about that. Let's skip here. In other words, Confucian selves are first and foremost sons and daughters, then siblings, friends, neighbors, students, teachers, lovers, spouses, perhaps much else, but not autonomous individuals. So you're not primarily individual, you're defined by all your relationships. Part of your relationship is you're defined as a student now, and you have relationships hopefully with your teachers, right? If we go to the very bottom of the first column, last sentence, the second column, last sentence, page 306, it goes, consider how Confucius will respond to the identity crisis so many undergraduate students undergo at some point during their college career. When Mary Smith asks Mary Smith asks, "Who am I?" the master will first respond straightforwardly. "You are obviously the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Smith, and the sister of Tom Smith. You are the friend of X, Y, and Z, the roommate of W, the student of Professors A, B, C, and D, and so forth." To which Mary will undoubtedly reply, "I don't mean that, I'm searching for the real me." To which Confucius could only respond sadly, shaking his head, "No wonder you call it a crisis, for you have taken away everything that could possibly count as answers to your question." I kind of love, this professor wrote this, I love that. Isn't that kind of a great example? Is that basically, when you strip all your relationships away, there's nothing left, is what he's saying, right? That's really what you are. Let's go really quickly to page 308, in the, I don't know, third full paragraph of page 308. Confucius insists that we cannot really rest content with seeing to the material needs of our parents. Filial piety is something much more than that. We must not only meet our familial obligations, but must also have the proper attitude towards them. That's what I said, not just go through the motions, right, of doing it. We must want to meet our responsibilities. We must have feelings appropriate to the situation. This is why Confucius could not bear to see the rituals of mourning conducted purely informally without genuine grief. So the key is, you should be mourning for a parent for several years, but you should really mourn. It shouldn't be a fake mourn, right? Well, I gotta do it, it's my obligation. No, you go through it because it is important to you to go through it. All right, so I'm assuming you read the rest of it, we don't have time. I want to touch a little bit about the test. Does anybody have any question on Confucius? You guys feel like you have a pretty good understanding of Confucius? Don't you feel sorry for anybody who didn't show up today? I mean, how are they going to answer the question? Yeah.
So, if someone not following, like, would it be better to like not do the ritual at all than to do the ritual?
I think so. If you can't do a meeting, it's just wasting your time. Notice how Taoism and Confucianism on this ritual issue are totally opposite, right? He's big on ritual, Taoism would tell you it's unnatural why you've been doing it. So they competed in China, so it's weird in a sense. If a Chinese person has these influences that have some similarities but a lot of really big differences, and you say, and even a modern Chinese person, I think has them. It's kind of like they're pulled in different directions, but they actually are still exposed to both of these influences today. All right, let's talk about the test a little bit. So.